I'll share my screen. Does that look good to everyone? Okay. Yeah, so thank you very much for inviting me here today. I'm really excited to be giving this talk to you guys today. Laura and I were just talking about how, we wouldn't have this opportunity if it weren't for the current state of things. So I guess that's kind of a nice silver lining. So the talk that I'm going to give you guys today, like Laura mentioned, is about sort of this circuit that attention and visual working memory create, and how their reciprocal and flexible interactions support goal-driven behavior in particular, and then what happens to this sort of circuit that they make when it fails. And so I'm going to start broad and talk about kind of my broader research question and research interests before I narrow in on the more specific questions I'll be talking about today. So our visual environments are incredibly complex, and we have to somehow find a way to parse these environments to extract only what's important for a particular goal in order to interact with these environments in a meaningful way. And one of the things that really interests me is understanding how our minds and our brains deal with this complexity. And so this big overarching question led me to visual cognitive neuroscience, because it's a field with a lot of different avenues for studying this question. And so one avenue for the research that I've pursued comes from looking at how mechanisms like attention and visual working memory support goal-driven behavior. And just to make sure that we start off on the same page, I'm just going to coarsely kind of define these here at the start, where visual attention is this mechanism that allows you to really hone in on the important aspects of your visual environment, select what's important to a current goal, and sort of filter out or restrict things that aren't important. And then visual working memory is that online storage system for visual information that allows you to maintain a small piece of it internally in the absence of external input. And so what I find particularly interesting about these mechanisms is how they interact. And so each of them are inherently limited in their capacities. We can't pay attention to everything at a given time. And visual working memory is sort of famously capacity limited. So it's thought that we can actually only maintain up to about the equivalent of 3 to 4 pieces of information in memory at a time. But these are really foundational mechanisms for supporting goal-driven behavior and supporting these interactions with the environment. So to compensate, they interact with each other to ensure that each mechanism is being used most effectively, and they form this circuit that's really critical in guiding behavior. And so these circuits rely on filters to help streamline information through this system. And so you have this sort of overarching goal here. Can you guys see my mouse cursor? Okay. So you have this overarching goal here, and you sort of apply it to your visual processing, which allows you to filter out information from the environment that is not important. So let's say you're crossing the street, you're going to pay attention to the things that are important to that goal and filter other things out. And then there's sort of a second filter that restricts access to visual working memory resources, because again, these are highly capacity limited, and you don't want to waste those resources on items that are not important for a current goal. And so this kind of ensures that only the most important aspects of the environment are encoded into visual working memory and then used to guide subsequent behavior. And I'll mention here at the outset that this particular filter to visual working memory is really thought to operate, or traditionally has been thought to operate as sort of this on and off switch. So it's an in or out, all or none type of filter that accepts things that are important and rejects things that are not. So if we bring this back to our complex visual environment, let's say your goal in this particular circumstance is to safely cross this street. Well, what you're going to do is restrict, you're going to restrict your attention to only the aspects of the scene that are most important to achieving this goal. So you're going to notice the location of this nearby streetcar, probably the locations of other nearby vehicles, and in particular, the stop signals or the signals that are telling you whether or not it's safe to cross. And you're going to attend to these things at the expense of other aspects of this environment that may be equally salient, but are not as important, like the color of this pedestrian's t-shirt, for instance. And then that information, once it's attended and selected, is going to be encoded into visual working memory. at the expense of other features of the environment, and then used to help guide subsequent attention and decision-making, like your decision to wait before you cross the street. So, like I said, my overarching goal is really to understand how our minds parse this complexity in our visual environments. And so today I'm going to talk to you about some of the specific progress I've made towards better understanding this. And I'm going to do it through two broad themes. So in the first theme, or the first half of my talk, I'm going to talk to you about how attention and visual working memory work together in this sort of reciprocal fashion. And they do so very flexibly, and much more flexibly than we once thought. And this is work that I did primarily during graduate school with my advisor, Nassim Ali-Drous, and our collaborator, Steve Emmerich. And then in theme two, I'm going to talk to you about what happens when this circuit fails. So in particular, if something in the environment captures your attention, what happens to these filters that are so important in guiding this goal-driven behavior? And in particular, I'm going to talk to you about a theory that we've been developing called the filter disruption theory. And this is work that I'm doing with my postdoc advisor, Julie Gollum. Okay, so to start, as I mentioned, one of the biggest questions that guides not only my research, but a ton of the research in the field is how is it that we're able to use working memory to help support behavior despite how limited it is? And so major progress was made in our understanding of this back in 2005, when Vogel and his colleagues isolated a mechanism that they thought supported the exclusion of irrelevant information from visual working memory. So in particular, they used a paradigm that looked like this, where they had participants remember the orientations of items of a specified color on a cued side of a bilateral memory display for a subsequent change detection task. So in this case, remember the orientations of the purple items on the left. Did any of those orientations change? And during this task, they measured an ERP component known as the CDA, or contralateral delay activity. And what's important about the CDA is that its amplitude is thought to reflect the amount of information that's currently being stored in visual working memory, where higher CDA amplitudes mean more information is currently in memory, and lower CDA amplitudes mean less information is currently in memory. And they measured the CDA across 3 different conditions in this experiment. So in the first, they presented 2 targets here alongside 2 concurrent distractors. In the second, they presented 2 targets in isolation. And in the third, they presented 4 targets with no concurrent distractors. And the idea here is that if participants are able to, in particular, use attention to effectively exclude irrelevant information from being encoded into visual working memory, then what you should see is that CDA amplitudes should be comparable in these 2 conditions where there are 2 targets presented, regardless of whether or not there are concurrent distractors, because in that case, participants are able to use attention to effectively attend only to these relevant items and only encode these relevant items in memory, restricting these sort of yellow representations from unnecessarily consuming working memory capacity. If they can't restrict irrelevant information from memory, then you should see CDA amplitudes that are comparable in these 2 conditions. So condition 1 up here with these 4 items, and condition 3 down here. Because in this case, they're not able to effectively exclude these distractors from consuming working memory capacity. And so in both cases, they would have 4 pieces of information in memory and comparable CDA amplitudes across both conditions. Now, for high performers, they did find evidence that they were able to exclude those irrelevant distractors from being encoded into memory. And so this is what the CDA looked like. So I'll first orient you to this blue line, which is the 4 target condition. So this condition down here. And then the black line, which is the 2 target condition. So this condition right here. And the question was, where is this red line going to fall? Is it going to look more like the 2 target condition or more like the 4 target condition? And for high performers, it really does look more like this 2 target condition. And so participants are able to use attention to effectively restrict that unnecessary stuff from being encoded into memory. Low performers, on the other hand, were not able to do this. So low performers seem to encode all 4 of these things in memory, even when they were explicitly told not to. And so Vogel and his colleagues from this work concluded that attention really serves as this simple in and out filter to visual working memory that restricts irrelevant information from being encoded and unnecessarily consuming those limited resources in working memory. And this was a theory that was popularized by analogy to nightclubs, where attention is sort of the bouncer in the brain that works at the visual working memory nightclub and restricts unwanted guests from entering this working memory nightclub. And I'm going to kind of come back to this, this bouncer analogy a couple times, so stay with me on that one. But is attention really just a simple in and out filter, or is attention doing more than simply filtering information in and out? So in particular, this simple filter account assumes that the role of attention is just to exclude any information that's not consistent with the current goal from consuming working memory capacity. So if I tell you, here is 4 pieces of information, I will test your memory for the color of a square. If attention really is a simple on and off filter, what we should see is that the squares are always encoded and the circles are always not. But since the conception of this simple filter account, more recent work has started to focus on unequal representations within working memory itself. So among encoded information, sometimes some of it's just better remembered than others. And this really reflects a capability that extends beyond this simple in or out filter. And in reality, our goals are almost never this definitive. It's more likely that we sort of preferentially attend to something. So what happens to this filter under less certain circumstances? So if, for instance, I were to give you these same 4 pieces of information, but I instead tell you, we will probably test your memory for the color of a square. How does this filter operate under these conditions of uncertainty? So if it is the case that this filter really is a simple in or out, on or off type of simple filter, then what we should see is that even under uncertainty, we always encode those squares and we never encode those circles. You know, we take our best guess at what's going to be important, and then we apply that filter all or nothing. But maybe it's the case that this filter is a little bit more flexible than we once thought. And maybe it actually operates more like a dial, where we can say, okay, these squares are the most likely to be important, but it's still worth my time to encode some information about these circles. And so maybe in this case, attention can actually operate flexibly to sort of regulate how working memory resources are distributed amongst these encoded representations, where those representations that are more likely to be important are remembered with better precision than those that are less likely to be important, but may still be the object of some upcoming test. So to answer the question of how this filter operates under uncertainty, we used a behavioral paradigm. So at the start of each trial, participants in this case were shown 4 colored shapes. 2 of them were always circles and 2 were always squares. And then after a brief delay, they were probed on one of those memory items that they just saw and asked to indicate its color by clicking a corresponding spot on this continuous color wheel that surrounded the display. Now, to manipulate attention across 4 blocks of this experiment, we gave participants explicit information about the probability that we would probe one of the squares over one of the circles. And now this goal shape was counterbalanced, but for the purposes of this talk, I'm just going to act like the target shape was always squares. And so across these blocks, we told them a square is going to be probed on either 60% of trials, 70%, 80%, or 90% of trials. And so with this manipulation, we were able to not only manipulate attention, but manipulate the value of that attentional goal, or how important those squares are. So squares are always more important than circles, but how much more important are they? And does that information afford those squares any further benefit in memory, where as they become more important, they're encoded in memory with greater precision? Now, we measured memory performance in this task using a couple of different metrics. All of them included some analysis of the errors that they were making in their color reporting. So I'll give you just kind of a brief description of how we measured performance, and I'm happy to talk more about this later on if anyone is interested. But first, what we do is we look at their distribution of raw response errors in a given condition of the experiment. And so these distributions tend to look like this, where they're centered on the correct target color, and then they break away into these tails. And there's some debate about what these tails are, but I'm not going to get into that today. And what we can do is we can actually take the standard deviation of this distribution as a measure of how precise their memory reporting is in this particular condition. And we can look at this, which I call raw standard deviation, across different conditions in this experiment. So we can compare raw SD across the 60% condition and the 90% condition to evaluate whether standard deviation changes as a function of this probability manipulation. And so you can kind of see here that a wider standard deviation here reflects less precision in color responding. So responses that are more widely centered around that target color. And a smaller standard deviation reflects more precise color reporting or better memory, because responses are more tightly centered around that target color, and they're more closely remembering the actual target color in that case. And raw standard deviation is a useful metric, and it's one that I'm going to use today, but it does conflate a couple of different sources of error that people make in a task like this, that you can disentangle with the use of modeling. And so there are a number of models out there that can help you sort of disentangle the different distributions that are working together to make this larger distribution that you're looking at. So a standard mixture model, for instance, allows you to have separate estimates of guess rate, which is this uniform distribution that is kind of a straight line across the entire distribution. And now the height of this uniform distribution is the probability that a participant is guessing in a given condition, because if a participant is guessing in a situation like this, they're equally likely to select any of these colors along the wheel. And then you can sort of isolate that distribution that reflects correct color responding, which I'm not sure if you can see super well here, but it's in yellow here. And then once you've isolated that correct distribution, you can evaluate the standard deviation of that distribution. And there are a couple other parameters that you can look at. But for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to focus specifically on standard deviation as our measure of sort of precision in memory. And we did use a number of different models that I will be happy to talk about. We used, in particular, what I'm going to show you today are mixture models and then a variable precision model. I know you guys recently had Tim Brady come and speak to you. So we did use both of these models. And they really converged on kind of the same point. So for the purposes of this talk, I'm just going to kind of talk to you about the standard deviation or precision parameter in all of these models. And then we can kind of get into nitty-gritties of the models later if you guys are interested. So what we can do is we can look at this performance across the different probability conditions in our experiment to ask the question, okay, we know that participants are going to be prioritizing these squares, but does manipulating how important those squares are afford any further benefit in working memory? If the answer is no, then what we should see is just this flat line across all of these probability conditions. Now, this flat line might be lower or better for valid trials than invalid trials. So maybe their precision for the squares is higher, or their standard deviation is lower for these squares relative to the circles. But manipulating how valuable those squares are really affords them no benefit beyond that. So this is if attention really is just that simple in or out filter. But if attention is playing a role in distributing in distributing resources in working memory, what we should instead see is sort of this sloped line where, as probability increases, the precision of those representations is getting stronger, or standard deviation is getting lower, kind of systematically across these probability conditions. And so this is really what we're going to be looking for in the graphs that I'm about to show you. And so I'm going to point out that the y-axis here is standard deviation, and this can really be thought of as 1 over precision. But because I'm using a couple different metrics, I've labeled all of my y-axes sort of 1 over precision. So you can think of them all as being 1 over precision, though the exact naming of the parameters is going to vary across the models. Okay, so for the results, I will first point out that we ran two different versions of this experiment. The only difference was that in experiment 1A, we ran it with a set size 4, and experiment 1B, we used set size 6. Again, here the results really converged kind of on the same point. So I'm just going to bring up everything for you all at once. So here we have our raw SD, we have our mixture model SD in the middle, and then our variable precision model, 1/precision on the right. And what I'll point out here is that across both versions of this experiment, you really are seeing this sort of systematic decrease in SD or systematic increase in precision across these probability conditions. So as a relevant item becomes more important or more relevant or more likely to be probed, it is encoded in memory with increasing precision. So items that are 90% likely to be probed are encoded with greater precision than those that are 60% likely to be probed. And I'm just going to point out here that the results that I just showed you were, these are all tests on valid trials. So when I said we were going to be probing a square, and then we actually probed a square. And this is for a couple of different reasons, not the least of which is that it's difficult with the models to model those invalid trials because there are often not enough of them. So I will quickly just point out that we did replicate this effect using a slightly adjusted design that allowed us to get more of those invalid trials so that we could actually plot those invalid trials alongside those valid trials, which gives us a much broader range of probabilities. And even over this broad range of probabilities, we're still seeing, again, that systematic increase in precision as items become more relevant. So attention really doesn't seem to be this simple in or out filter. It actually dynamically and flexibly regulates how resources within visual working memory are distributed. So to bring you back kind of to this toy example that I was showing you, it really doesn't seem to be the case that this filter is operating on this on or off switch. Really, it looks like it's more of a dial where, it lets in a lot of information about relevant things and then kind of tightens the dial to let in only a little bit of information about stuff that's not likely to be relevant, but still worth remembering. And this allows us to, of course, remember the things that are the most important with the greatest precision. So the things that are more likely to be useful, like this immediately nearby streetcar or the hand signal telling us not to cross, are slightly more important than this car that's facing away. And to bring it back to this bouncer analogy, attention really seems to be both the bouncer and the host for this visual working memory nightclub, where it's not only determining who gets to go into the nightclub, but also how much of the club's resources that particular guest is getting based on, I guess, how important they are.
Blaire, may I interrupt for a question?
Yeah.
So is it possible that attention is an in or out filter, but on some trials, when there is a high chance that one item will be tested, it just happens to select that item? Maybe the person was a bit curious, maybe it was imperfect, but still in an all or none manner, but on that trial it was imperfect. And when you took the average across trials, you ended up with the pattern you observed. So is that possible? And if so, can we have some sort of maybe modeling approach to compare these two explanations? One is, as you mentioned, more of a continuous distribution on every trial versus an all or none distribution on every trial, but at different proportions or probabilities across trials.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and one that we are definitely interested in. And with the data that we have, it is a little bit difficult to tease that apart. A couple of things that I will say are that there are no intertrial effects. And so you could imagine if there really is this sort of probability matching that's going on, you might expect there to be some intertrial effects where, in the 90% condition, if there are a number of valid trials in a row, they might switch that strategy over to invalid trials. And we really see no rhyme or reason to the strategies that they're engaging in on trial to trial. But the other thing is that we see this type of pattern even within a single trial. And so the tricky thing about the design that I just showed you is that it's that type of thing is difficult to disentangle, because on a given trial, there's only one item that we're testing on and one probability for that trial. But we actually find that if on a single trial, you give participants multiple probabilities for the items that are being shown concurrently on that trial, you get the same sort of flexible distribution of resources even within a single trial, which is sort of a stronger case, I think, for this account. Still doesn't entirely disentangle it. But again, I think it is a stronger case for that sort of flexibility. It's much more difficult to do that sort of probability matching in that case. But it's a question that we're still interested in and that I get a lot. So we are trying to plan some follow-ups to help answer that question.
Yep, great, thank you.
Thanks. Okay, so attention really does seem to be operating really flexibly and dynamically here at encoding. But what are the limits to this flexibility? Can we flexibly reprioritize information after encoding has already taken place? So behaviors don't always rely on a goal, or these goals, sorry, behaviors don't always rely on information that is directly in front of you. You don't always have the chance to apply this goal to the processing of visual information that's still available. Sometimes you remember a bunch of information and then this goal only becomes available afterwards. So after that information is no longer available. So can we retroactively apply a goal to information that's already in visual working memory in order to redistribute those resources so that the items that are retroactively determined to be the most important get a greater share of those resources even after encoding has already taken place? So to answer this question, oh, sorry, I have some more here to tell you. So we do know that memory performance can benefit from adopting a goal retroactively like this. So even when attention is internal, it can still benefit memory performance. So a retro cue, or a cue that's presented after encoding has already taken place, can direct your internal attention to the information that's most relevant to the upcoming memory test, ultimately enhancing performance for that cued item. So if, for instance, I were to show you these 4 shapes and say, remember all of the colors that you see here. And then after I take them away, I say, we will test your memory for the color of a square. Not only can you use that information to retroactively boost those squares, you're going to perform better on tests of these squares than of the circles, but you're also going to perform better on tests of those squares than if I hadn't cued you at all. So there is some evidence that internal attention may operate in sort of a similar way to external attention in this way. And this filter mechanism is dynamic and flexible when it's applied to external information. What about internal information? So what if I instead said, we will probably test your memory for the color of a square? Can you use that information retroactively to flexibly redistribute those resources? So to answer this question, we used a really similar method to the one that I've already introduced you to, where at the start of the trial, they were shown these 4 colored shapes, and at the end, we probed their memory for one of the shapes. Now, the difference here is that their goal, rather than being given to them at the start of a block of trials, was given to them after encoding had taken place on each individual trial in the form of this word cue. So we gave them this retro cue following encoding that signaled the shape that was most likely to be probed on that particular trial. And then again, across blocks, we gave them explicit information about the probability that this cue was going to be valid. So 60, 70, 80, or 90% of trials, this cue is valid. And then we measured memory performance in the same ways that I showed you before. So the first thing that I'm going to show you is raw standard deviation. And I'm going to bring up both performance on valid and on invalid trials. And the first thing that I'm going to point out is that they are doing better on valid trials than on invalid trials. So they are doing better on tests of those squares across all the probability conditions relative to tests of those circles. And this is the retro Q benefit. So we gave them a goal retroactively and they were able to use it to help benefit performance. But the other thing that you probably notice here is that the value of this goal, or how important those squares were, didn't afford them any further benefit regarding the precision of that representation. And that holds across all of our different models that we used. Now, one of the things that was different in the design that I just showed you relative to experiment 1 that I talked about is that the goal was given on each trial. So the goal changed from trial to trial. It was variable, whereas in experiment 1, that goal really was static across the entire block. So squares are important and they're always important across an entire block. And so maybe the flexibility is only afforded when a goal is static and not variable. So I'll just quickly mention that we did replicate this using a variable pre-Q and retro Q condition. And again, we manipulated the validity of that Q across blocks. And I'll point out that we replicated the effect using a pre-Q. So when the information was given to them prior to encoding, they were able to use that probability manipulation to benefit behavior. So they're doing better in this 80% condition relative to the 60% condition. And then again, we replicated this inflexibility using a retro Q. So when this information was given after encoding had already taken place, though they were able to use it to benefit performance, the magnitude of that benefit didn't rely on how valid that Q was. So though retro Qs do benefit working memory performance, the validity of that Q doesn't flexibly determine resource distribution. So, we can use that goal, apply it retroactively to sort of boost one representation over the other, but we can't sort of flexibly redistribute those resources based on how important that piece of information is. And to bring this back to our bouncer analogy, though attention does seem to be both the bouncer and the host to this visual working memory nightclub, the host really seems to only work at the door. So that resource distribution happens at encoding, it happens at the door, not retroactively once the guests are already inside. Now, at this point, you might be thinking to yourself, why does this matter? And the reason it matters is because it turns out that the way we encode information really has consequences for how that information is used to guide subsequent behavior. So if, for instance, you are looking for your keys on a cluttered desk, what you might do is activate a representation of this orange keychain that you have, so that you can use that to enhance your detection of perceptually similar representations in the environment. So attention is going to be guided towards elements of the environment that share features with this sort of active representation. And this sort of representation in memory, bringing something into a state where it can interact with attention in this way is known as giving it template status. So you're using that representation as a search template, it has template status, and as such, it's able to guide attention or bias attention towards matching information. Now, one of the things that we know about assigning a representation template status in memory is that it inherently gives it the best precision in memory. So if you are maintaining some things in memory and you decide one of them is going to be a search template, it gets this sort of boost in memory where it's maintained with the greatest precision relative to other information that might be concurrently maintained in memory. And I just showed you at least one other way that we can boost precision in memory. So we can prioritize the encoding of a representation in memory for later recall, and we can give it enhanced precision by doing so. So does encoding an item in working memory with this enhanced precision cause it to inherently become a search template? So by virtue of being encoded with the greatest precision, does that also mean that that representation will ultimately bias attention, even in circumstances where it may not be necessary? Now, in the interest of time, I'm not actually going to go into these experiments. I'll just quickly tell you that Flexibly prioritizing a piece of information in memory so that it's maintained with the greatest precision doesn't automatically cause that representation to become a search template. And we think the reason for this is that these two forms of prioritization, so prioritization for memory recall and prioritization for search, are really distinct forms of prioritization in visual working memory and accomplished via distinct mechanisms. So to summarize theme one, I've shown you that attention and visual working memory really interact in this reciprocal way that's much more flexible than we once thought was possible. So attention really does regulate the flexible distribution of resources in visual working memory, but this only happens at encoding. You can't flexibly redistribute these resources. So this flexibility itself has its limits. And this is the mechanism that supports this type of prioritization for recall really is distinct from other forms of prioritization in visual working memory. Now, as you're interacting with this environment and your goal here is to cross the street, we now have a good sense of sort of what's involved here, the filters that are involved, how we prioritize things for attention, how we prioritize things for working memory. What happens if while you're trying to cross this street, an ambulance appears? Now, we know that this ambulance is going to be kind of a distractor in this environment, and it's likely going to capture your attention. So spatial attention will move towards the location of that distractor, and it will make you take longer to make your decision to ultimately stop before crossing this street. So we have a really good sense of the consequences of distraction for spatial attention and for response times. So the time it takes you to decide whether or not you're going to cross the street will increase in contexts where there's an ambulance present relative to when there's no ambulance present at all. And this is attentional capture. Now, in a lab, attentional capture, it would typically be studied with a paradigm that looks something like this, where you have participants searching for this Landolt stimulus that has the gap on the right or the left side. And then when there's no distractor, so when these are all colored the same way, you get sort of a baseline response time. So baseline amount of time that it takes them to respond to the orientation of their target. But if one of those items is uniquely colored or stands out in some way and captures attention, it will increase search response times. And so this here is attentional capture by a singleton distractor in this display. But of course, there's more at play in a scene like this than just where your spatial attention is. So we know that there are these filters that really underlie this sort of goal-driven behavior and decision-making. So what happens to these filters? Does distraction also disrupt these filters, these highly controlled filters that are in place to help support behavior? So in experiment 1 of theme 2, I'm specifically going to ask the question, does dynamic distraction disrupt the filter that prioritizes goal-relevant information for attention? So while information is available to you and you're kind of weeding out information and you have a control setting and you have tight control over it, when you're distracted, do you lose control of that filter? So to answer this question, we used an fMRI task. And specifically in the scanner, we had participants using these or viewing these face house hybrid images. And so this is a half transparent face overlaid with a half transparent house. And the reason we use these images in particular is that it allowed us to manipulate attention. So attend to the faces, ignore the houses, or vice versa, independent of a spatial manipulation. And the first thing we did in the scanner was we localized two ROIs, so two regions of the brain that specialize in processing faces, so the fusiform face area, and places or houses, the parahippocampal place area. And after this localizer task, we had participants perform the primary task in the scanner. So in this primary task, at the start of each block of trials, they were told whether they should attend faces or houses in the trials that were to come. And then they performed, on each trial, they saw sort of an array of 4 face house hybrid images. One of them was identified as their target via this thick white border. And they performed a 1-back task based on this target. So is the face in this image the same face that was in the image immediately preceding it, yes or no? And the idea is that If participants are able to effectively attend to the faces and filter out the houses, then what we should see on these trials is on attend face blocks, we should see greater FFA activity relative to PPA activity, which reflects stronger processing of those faces and filtering out those houses. But importantly here, on some trials, a distractor appeared in this display. And the distractor was this salient white border that flashed really briefly around one of those non-target hybrid squares. And now we expect here on these trials that this distractor is going to capture spatial attention. So spatial attention is likely going to move to the location of this distractor. Response times in the n-back task or in the one-back task are going to be longer on distractor present trials relative to distractor absent trials. But the real question is what happens to that filter that's currently in place to prioritize those faces and filter out the houses? If it's the case that distraction really only disrupts spatial attention and leaves that filter in place, then even on distractor present trials during attend face blocks, we should still see greater FFA activity relative to PPA activity, reflecting that they are still filtering out the houses and processing those faces. But if distraction does disrupt that attentional filter that's in place to prioritize the faces, then what we should see is that on attend faces blocks and distractor present trials, we see this incidental increase in PPA activity, or an increase in the part of the brain that processes houses. Because what's happening is they're incidentally processing the house in this image rather than the face, following kind of the breakdown of that attentional filter. So the first thing I'll show you is our behavioral data, mostly just to convince you that our distractor was sufficiently distracting. So we're getting longer response times in distractor present relative to distractor absent trials. But of course, what we really care about is the activation that's happening in those two ROIs. So I'll show you first activation in the FFA and in the PPA on distractor absent trials. And so what we're seeing here is greater activation in the FFA on attend faces relative to attend houses trials, and greater activation in the PPA on attend houses relative to attend faces trials. And this, again, is just evidence of effective attentional filtering. So when there's no distractor present, they're really able to attend to their target stimulus category and filter out that non-target stimulus category, and they're able to do it pretty nicely. And I'll remind you here that across all of these conditions, the stimuli that they're seeing are identical. The only difference is what they're being told to extract from this image. So whether it's an attend house block or an attend face block. So before I show you what happens on those distractor present trials, I'm just going to reorient you slightly to look at this data a little bit differently. So here I've plotted both of the ROIs together, and I'm showing preferred versus non-preferred. And so preferred is both FFA activity during attend faces and PPA activity during attend houses. So it's this sort of yellow bar here combined with this orange bar. And then non-preferred is PPA activity during attend faces and FFA activity during attend houses. And again, this difference here is reflecting effective attentional filtering. So they're really able to prioritize the preferred stimulus and filter out that non-preferred stimulus. But what happens on distractor present trials? What happens to this evidence of filtering? It goes away. So what we see here is this relative increase in activation reflecting the processing of that non-preferred stimulus category. So this is processing houses on attend faces trials when there's a distractor present, and processing faces on attend houses trials when there's a distractor present. And what is surprising even to us is that this filter actually breaks so badly that it reverses. So we're actually seeing that non-target stimulus category is being prioritized to even a greater degree than what their initial control setting was kind of set for, tuned for. So distraction really does seem to disrupt this filter that prioritizes relevant information for attention. So when an ambulance appears in this scene, we are sort of incidentally prioritizing or processing information that is not important, like the color of this pedestrian's t-shirt. But does distraction also disrupt now this filter that regulates working memory encoding, such that these incidentally attended pieces of information are then slipping into or intruding into visual working memory in a way that allows them to sort of guide subsequent behavior? So to evaluate this question, we've capitalized on an effect known as memory-driven capture. And so attentional capture is the slowing of response times when a distractor is present in a display. Now, the cool thing is that when the color of this distractor matches the color of an item that's currently being maintained in memory, you actually get this exacerbated slowing of response times. So response times are slowed to an even greater degree than when there's just a regular singleton distractor present in the display and when the color is completely irrelevant. And you get this memory-driven capture even when color is entirely irrelevant. So even though this item you might be maintaining in memory, that in this case is red, isn't relevant to the current task, color is not relevant to the current search task that you're engaged in, that color will still attract attention to a greater degree than any other uniquely colored item in the display. And so here we've capitalized on memory-driven capture to use it as sort of an index to allow us to probe the contents of memory. So to the extent that we observe memory-driven capture driven by a specific feature, we can conclude that that feature was present in memory at the time of us observing this capture. So here we used a behavioral method where we had participants perform 2 sequential visual search tasks. Now in the first, we had them searching for the letter T among these L's and indicating if the T was upright or inverted. Now these these letters, always appeared on these colored squares, but they were told color is entirely irrelevant. Do your best to completely ignore color, only attend to the letters that are important for your search. Shortly after they performed this second search where they were looking for the Landolt C with the gap on the right or the left side and indicating which side that gap fell on. Now we manipulated a couple of different things in these search tasks. In the first, we manipulated whether there was a salient distractor present in this display. So on some trials, a white border flashed briefly around one of those non-target boxes. And the question here is, by virtue of capturing attention, does the color associated with that salient distractor, though it's completely irrelevant, intrude into memory and then guide attention in the subsequent search, such that we see memory-driven capture in search 2, when a singleton distractor matches its color relative to when it's any other color. So we manipulated the color of a singleton distractor that was always present in the display. And so here I'll point out there was always a singleton distractor present, so we predict that there's always going to be some degree of capture here. What we're looking for is exacerbated capture when this color matches the contents of memory. So our singleton distractor conditions for search 2 were it could match none of the previously viewed colors, so be a completely novel color to that trial. It could match one of the non-critical items from the previous search, so an item that was just seen, but not associated with a salient distractor, associated instead with a non-salient distractor. It could match the color associated with the target from search 1, or critically, it could match the color associated with that salient distractor from search 1. And our primary comparison of interest here is this non-critical match versus the salient distractor match. So both of these colors here are just seen colors. Both of them are irrelevant, but one of them was just associated with a salient distractor. So by virtue of being associated with that salient distractor, does this color intrude into memory and bias attention in a subsequent search to a greater degree than this other just seen color? So I'll start by showing you our RT results for search 1. Again, just to convince you that this salient distractor from search 1 was sufficiently distracting. So again, we're getting longer response times in the distractor present relative to distractor absent condition. Of course, what we care about is response times for search 2. So I'll remind you of our conditions here, and I'll bring up our first 3. And again, what we care about is response times in this salient distractor match condition. So are these response times slowed to a greater degree than, in particular, this non-critical match condition? And the answer is yes. So we're seeing memory-driven capture here by an irrelevant distractor feature. So by virtue of capturing attention in the first search, the irrelevant color associated with that distractor intruded into memory and is now biasing attention in this subsequent search. So we're now getting memory-driven capture in this subsequent search. So distraction really does seem to disrupt this filter that regulates working memory encoding. So not only are we incidentally attending to things that fall outside of that attentional control set, but those things are intruding into memory and biasing subsequent attention. And so these findings in particular are sort of the crux of this filter disruption theory that we have been developing. And this filter disruption theory says that dynamic distraction disrupts these filters that regulate both attentional selection and working memory encoding. And its primary predictions are that distraction disrupts filters that regulate attentional selection, which we provided evidence for in experiment 1 of theme 2, and that distraction disrupts attentional filtering for visual working memory, which we provided some evidence for in experiment 2 of theme 2. So overall, the take-home message here is that attention is a lot more flexible than we once thought. It regulates this flexible distribution of visual working memory resources such that it operates more like a dial than a switch. And those representations that are most likely to be important are encoded with the greatest precision in memory. But this really only happens at encoding. So once items have already been encoded, though you can apply a goal to sort of boost important information, you can't use goal value to afford any additional benefit. And distraction disrupts this attention visual working memory circuit altogether. So we attend to items that fall outside of that control set. We encode those representations so they intrude into memory, and then they bias subsequent search. So here I will say thank you to my advisors and collaborators and everyone in the OSU Vision and Cognitive Neuroscience Lab and NSERC for my funding. And thanks to you guys for your attention.